Holy cow, boy, did we have some technical problems or what? That was an absolute today. Right. All right. Boy, are we having technical difficulties today. Welcome to class, everybody. How's everybody doing? It is good to see you. Thanks for coming back. I really appreciate you dealing with the technical issues this morning. I had some serious problems today. Holy cow, I don't know what in the world's going on. Okay. Uh-oh, down to 4. All right, good. Yeah, I left my laptop on all night and I guess it just got cranky, so I needed to just reboot the whole system. So I shut everything down and brought it back up. Good to see you, Christine Marie. Good to see you, Emma. Good to see you, Ryan. Good to see you, April. Thanks for everybody coming back. Okay, good deal. Hopefully Ronique will be here momentarily as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started without further delay. Um, if you watched the lecture on Tuesday, what we were talking about this week is the behaviorist perspective. Now, this is not an area of psychology. This is not one of those subdivisions where you can get a PhD. You don't really get a behavioral PhD. This instead represents one way of looking at the human being and studying how human beings change and develop. Now, the behaviorists, if you remember on Tuesday, were environmentalists. They thought the most important thing that impacted human beings was their environment. And if you look at the quotes over here from John Watson, who is the father of behaviorism, you can see sort of that attitude towards the environment. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed in my own specified world in which to bring them up in, and I guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man, thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. John Watson was saying he could turn anybody into something good or something bad using the environment, regardless of race or genes or anything else like that. Now, what's important about this point of view is in the turn of the 20th century, there was a scientific point of view called a scientific movement called eugenics that wanted to sterilize people based on low IQ. And the idea was low IQ was inhibited, and some people were just basically inferior human beings. And so the behaviorists sort of contrasted that viewpoint, and they thought that really the problems in the world, all of people's failures could be pinned on their environment, not their human qualities, uh, uh, but their human environment. Krista Marie asks a question. There wasn't a lecture, but I posted a recorded lecture from last semester, Christine. I posted a recorded lecture from last week. So you can watch that if you want, and it's going to be sort of important. So environment is king. Environment is king. These people were certainly environmentalists. Uh, it's a February. It's a February date. I'm not sure right off the top of my head. Somebody else, if you can answer that question in the chat bar, I'm going to carry on. Now, here's the thing. The behaviorist also thought that it wasn't appropriate to study mental functioning. They thought that the mind was not a systematic apparatus. They sort of believed that trying to measure the mind was measuring something that didn't exist. So they were definitely very anti-mentalistic. They argued you can't really measure the mind because you can't see it. And even if you did, it doesn't matter anyway. And in fact, this is why they became known as the quote, behaviorists, behavior over mind. They argued that the only thing you can build scientific theories on are things you can observe. You can't observe the mind, but you can observe a behavior. Now, on Monday or Tuesday, we talked about one of the models of learning. So, how do human beings acquire behavior? If it doesn't come from their genes, if it doesn't come from their innate abilities, where exactly does learned behavior come from? Now, on Tuesday, you read about classical conditioning, which was learning by association. And I introduced you to Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. And what he would do is he would make the dog salivate, and he would ring a bell and make the dog salivate with some meat powder. And after a while, he could condition the dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. Read all about, or watch it and read all about it in your textbook. And in fact, John Watson, the famous behaviorist, even showed that you could classically condition a phobia in a human being. And he took a little 2-year-old boy named Little Albert, and he conditioned Little Albert to be phobic of all white furry animals. Okay, now today we're going to be talking about the second model, which is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning. Oh, you're right, Ryan. I'm sorry I put my summer lectures, not my spring lectures. I liked my summer lectures better, so I went with those. And you wasn't able to watch it yet either. Why weren't you able to watch it, Ryan? It wasn't technical problems. I'm hoping it was your desire, your motivation rather than technical problems. Go ahead and type in the chat bar. Now, here's the deal. In classical conditioning, your learner is passive. So the dog in Pavlov's study didn't do anything. It just noticed associations between events in its environment, and those associations created learning. In behaviorism, what we have is an active learner that engages in random behavior that incrementally becomes non-random based on environmental consequences. Let me break that down for a minute. Okay. What he argued is that human beings go out there and we just try things out. Human beings and animals just explore their environment. And some of the behaviors in which they engage in, some of these behaviors are reinforced or lead to rewards. And these behaviors tend to become repeated. Some behaviors, on the other hand, lead to punishment, right, or penalty. And those behaviors tend not to be repeated. So, this guy right below me, B.F. Skinner from Pennsylvania, argued that human beings go out there and we start with random behavior. And then as our environment reinforces or punishes our behavior begins to shape itself. And we do certain behaviors because they lead to positive consequences, and we avoid other behaviors because they lead to negative consequences. This is sort of the basis of what we're going to call operant conditioning, or it's sometimes called Skinnerian conditioning, after the scientist B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner argued that there are two types of consequences in your environment. There are reinforcers. And a reinforcer he defined as any consequence that makes a behavior more likely in the future. Now, I'm being a little bit oblique in my description of reinforcer. You might say, well, Chris, why don't you just say a positive consequence that makes a behavior more likely in the future? Consequences, reinforcing consequences can be different. Sometimes a reinforcing consequence is one in which the behavior leads to something positive. Sometimes, though, a behavior will lead to the removal of something negative. And you know what? That's reinforcing as well. Okay, so if you've ever removed a splinter, when you engage in that splinter pulling behavior, you're toe, your foot, your finger feels better because that thing has been removed. And so the next time you get a splinter, you're motivated to do that behavior. So there are two types of consequences. One is reinforcers. These are consequences that make a behavior more likely in the future. And we're going to contrast those with punishers, which are consequences that make a behavior less likely in the future. Now, this seems pretty simplistic. You're going to say, no, duh, Chris, I get this. Well, you know what? Back in Skinner's time, nobody had really talked about this scientifically. And actually, he took this to a more complex level. Now, if you look over there in the bottom left corner, you see a Skinner box or an operant conditioning chamber, as Skinner would have called it. And what this does is this allows this allows Skinner to study different schedules of reinforcement. That is, different ways of providing reinforcement to animals. Now, in this Skinner box, you'll see over on the far left side, there is a food pellet bowl, and you see there's a food tray with little pieces of food in there. And there's a lever that the rat can press. And you can set it so that every time that rat presses that lever, a piece of food is delivered to that animal. Or you can even set it so that the rat has to press the lever twice to get a piece of food, or 10, or however many times you want. So you can set that lever so that the mouse is rewarded after a certain number of bar presses. And then what he would do is he would run this thing called a cumulative recorder. It looks like one of those old school EKG machines where the paper rolls out. And he would have a needle on it. And every time that bar would get pressed, that needle would go up just a little bit. And if the bar wasn't pressed again, the needle would slowly drop. But if the needle kept getting, the lever kept getting pressed, the needle would continue to jump up as this paper rolled out. And so if you look at the cumulative recorder, what you'll notice is the rat goes from not responding, and then it presses the bar and the needle jumps up just a little bit. And then the rat starts pressing the bar a lot, and you see these jagged little steps. And these show that the rat is starting to press the bar more frequently. And so this cumulative recorder allows us to measure how often the rat is pressing the bar, and more importantly, when the rat is pressing the bar. Okay? And so what he would do is he would study different ways of reinforcing the animal. Okay? Now, one way to reinforce the animal is to give a piece of food every time that animal presses the bar. This is what's known as continuous reinforcement. But you know what? He found out that the rat could acquire the behavior, could learn the bar pressing behavior, even if you did not reinforce every bar pressing behavior. So he set up two different scenarios in which he did not give a piece of food for every bar pressed. He set up one he called a ratio method, and one he called an interval method. Now, in the ratio method, what he would do is he would pick a certain number of bar presses that he wanted to see before he would deliver food. It might be 2 bar presses. It might be 5 bar presses. It might be 10 bar presses. Okay? And what he would do is he would pick a ratio of bar presses, of lever presses, to reinforce. And he called this ratio reinforcement. Now, sometimes he would set it so that it was every 3rd bar press exactly. You can set it that way, okay? Or you can set it so that it happens every 3rd bar press on average, okay? Now, so what he found was that the animal would still learn to press the bar. The reinforcers still worked. Now, if any of you have ever taken your dog out and taught your dog a trick, and your dog knows how to go and pee outside, or your dog knows how to sit when you tell them to, or to come here when you tell them to, you don't reward the dog every time. All you do is you reward the dog occasionally. You give them a biscuit every now and then. And what happens is over time, that will keep that behavior in that dog's repertoire. Now, this is ratio method. Now, the neat thing is sometimes what he would do is he would reinforce the bar press using intervals of time. So he might say, I don't care how many times that rat presses the bar, I'm only going to reward one bar press every 10 seconds. So in the first 10 seconds, I'll reward the first bar press that occurs. After that, the animal can press the bar all they want. They're not getting a piece of food. But as soon as the next 10 seconds starts, I'm going to reinforce the first bar press in that second 10 seconds. And this is another partial reinforcement method called interval. The positive consequences provided at timed intervals if the behavior is performed during the interval. Okay? Now, he had two main insights from these experiments. Number one, you do not have to reinforce every behavior for learning to occur. You can reinforce a subset of those behaviors and animals will still acquire or learn a behavior. Now, here's the thing. On Tuesday, I suggested to you that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior, relatively permanent. What that means is that anything animals learn, like Pavlov's dog salivating or the animal pressing the bar, these behaviors will go away if the conditions that cause them go away. So if you quit reinforcing the bar pressing behavior, the bar pressing will eventually go away. The animal will lose the learned behavior. Or we sometimes say that the learned behavior is extinguished. That's a verb that I've talked about, extinguish is a verb that I talked about in yesterday's lecture. Okay, that means the behavior goes away. Now, here's the really cool insight that B.F. Skinner found. If you compare how long it takes for behavior to be extinguished with continuous reinforcement, if you compare that with how long it takes for behavior to go away that has been partially reinforced, what you're going to find is that learning stays longer if it's acquired through partial reinforcement. So if you want to teach the rat to press the bar, you can reinforce every behavior or you can reinforce a ratio of those behaviors. The behavior will still be learned. But if you quit rewarding that behavior, the rat that is learned through ratio rewards, ratio reinforcement, that behavior will stay around longer. Okay? Exactly. Ryan talks about the rat getting fat. That's a funny joke. You know, it's an interesting point that I didn't make in these lectures, but that I've got interviews where B.F. Skinner mentions it. You have to keep the animals hungry, and so what he would do is he would keep the birds at 75% of their normal weight. So basically, he starved his pigeons and rats till they were really skinny, and then he could use the reward as a reinforcer. When we talk about motivation in chapter 10 or 11, it is, I'm going to talk about theories of motivation. And these external based theories only work if the animal has a deficit of some sort. That's a really funny point that you made, Ryan. Great point. Okay. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if you've ever been to the zoo or actually if you've watched movies, you've seen animals do crazy complex behaviors. And in fact, B.F. Skinner argued that everything that you do, from reading to driving a car to playing baseball to knitting a hat, all of these behaviors are learned through shaping, through reinforcements and consequences, right? Now, here's the thing though, human beings engage in complex behaviors. And in order for a complex behavior to be learned, according to Skinner, the animal would have to engage in that. But you know what? Dogs don't jump on surfboards randomly. They have to be coaxed onto surfboards. And so there's a big difference between learning how to press a bar and learning how to drive a car, right? Two very different ones. One of them simple, one's complex. So how are these complex behaviors learned? This is actually going to be the focus of our class of our webinar this afternoon and tonight. We're going to be talking about shaping. And shaping is the way in which Skinner argued complex behaviors are learned. And shaping by successive approximations means reinforcing behaviors that start out not so similar to the desired behavior, but wind up becoming similar to the desired behavior. And so what you might do, if you look at this gentleman down here shaping his dog to ride a surfboard, the first thing he's going to do is take his dog out to the beach and put the surfboard on the water. And what he's going to do, he's going to try to sit the dog on the surfboard. Now, the first time he does that, that dog's going to jump off the surfboard. I promise you. He's going to think it's weird and he's not going to like it. But he's going to keep putting that dog on the surfboard. And at some point, that dog is going to stay on the surfboard. As soon as that dog does stay on the surfboard, he's going to reinforce that behavior. He's going to reinforce that behavior. And after a while, that dog is going to get on that surfboard. Now, he'll keep reinforcing that behavior, but you know what? He's then going to try to push that surfboard. Now, the first time he does that, the dog's going to jump off, but he'll put the dog back on the surfboard. The dog's learned how to sit on the surfboard, and he'll start pushing it again. The dog will probably get nervous and jump off the surfboard again. But after 3 or 4 tries, that dog will stay on the surfboard and he'll be able to push it and the dog will move. And once that happens, he'll reinforce that behavior, right? Now, he'll reinforce that behavior for a while, and then what he'll do is he'll push the dog hard enough and let go of it. Let go of the dog. Now, the dog will probably jump off of the surfboard at that point, but he'll put him back on there. He'll push him and let go, and the dog will jump off again. But maybe the 3rd or 4th time when he does that, that dog will stay on the surfboard. And then what he'll do is he'll reinforce the dog for that complex behavior. So here's the deal. In number 1, we started with a dog that's afraid of standing on a surfboard. We taught it how to stand on a surfboard. We then taught it to stand on that surfboard while we were moving it. We then taught it to stand on that surfboard after we pushed it fast and let it go. So in a sense, what we did was we reinforced successive approximations, that is, behaviors that started to get closer to the complex behavior that we wanted. Okay? Now, you can do this with lots of different animals, and you can do this with human beings, and this is how we all learn complex behaviors. Now, what I'm going to do today in class is I'm going to show you how you can train a dog to turn on the light switch. And we're going to talk about these complex behaviors and how that we can train our animals to engage in these complex and interesting behaviors. Okay? Now, I'm going to add a little complexity here, just a little bit of complexity. If you remember at the beginning, I told you that reinforcers are consequences that make a behavior more likely. I didn't say reinforcers are good things. I didn't say reinforcers are rewards. I said reinforcers are consequences. I then gave you that pulling the splinter out of your finger as an example, and you probably didn't understand that. But here's where I'm going to try to explain that just a little more in a little more detail. Okay. Now the weird thing is Sometimes a consequence can be the adding of something positive, like some food, or every time your dog goes outside and uses the bathroom, you give it a snack. That's what we would call a positive reinforcer. You gave that animal something good. And so a positive reinforcer is when a positive stimulus is added to the animal after the behavior. So positive reinforcer is when you add something positive to the animal after it engages in the behavior. Okay? Now, on the other hand, what you can do is you can take something negative away from the animal and make it more likely to engage in the behavior. So, I don't know if any of you folks have ever seen a choker collar. Does anyone know what a choker collar is? Anybody ever seen a choker collar? What's the purpose of a choker collar on a dog? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm not sure if anybody's following this quickly enough to say this. Okay. Now, sometimes we can engage in consequences that cause a behavior to occur. Okay, good. To get the dog to stop pulling. Absolutely, absolutely. So when the dog is walking in the wrong direction, you place pressure on that throat. And that pressure is uncomfortable to the dog. So the dog is in an aversive state, an aversive state. And then what that happens, if the dog walks in the direction you want them to, the negative goes away. That's what we would call a negative reinforcer, a negative reinforcer. So what I could do is I put you in an aversive state. Pull the choker collar tight, and then when you walk in the correct direction, the negative pressure on your neck goes away. So that's what we call a negative reinforcer. So one involves adding something positive, and a negative reinforcer means taking something negative away when you do the behavior. Now we're going to differentiate those from punishers. A punisher is designed to make a behavior less likely in the future. So any behavior that is followed by a punishing consequence is less likely to happen in the future. Now this is kind of confusing because we always think of punishers as negative, but you have to strip the positive and negative away from the consequence, punisher and reinforcer. Think about them as two different things. They're kind of like a mathematical equation. So a positive punisher means adding a punisher, adding a punisher. Negative punisher means taking away something good. Okay. So, in a positive punisher, you give the learner something they don't like. You add aversive consequences to make them less likely to do the behavior in the future. So, have any of you ever seen a dog spanked for chewing up a furniture or spanked for pooping on the floor? A lot of people will do that as a typical positive punishment for a behavior they don't want their dog to do. The idea behind this is that if you add an aversive consequence, slaps to the butt, the dog will associate these negative consequences with that behavior, and then the dog won't want to do that behavior. Okay? Now, on the other hand, you can also use what's known as a negative punisher. So, did any of you ever lose your video game, your cell phone, or your car because you did something bad? Back in my day, they would take your car keys away. If your parents would take your car keys away if you did something bad. I'm assuming today's parents would probably take the cell phone away. If you lose something you like because you did something bad, your parent is using what's known as a negative punisher. Okay, they're taking away something the learner likes to make them less likely to do the behavior in the future. Now, look at these examples below me. I've got a son named Zachary. I call him Z. And Z is a hard case, man. He needs to be trained. And I've been trying to train Z up to do the right things. So, can you tell me what I am doing in each of these four situations? Am I using a reinforcer or a punisher? Or am I using a positive or a negative reinforcer or a positive or a negative punisher? So, number one, if I give Z $20 every time he makes an A on his report card, what am I doing? And I will wait for my answer. This is the class demo part. What am I doing? Do you know? Positive reinforcer. Absolutely. Good job. I'm giving reinforcement because I want him to make an A again, correct? And I'm giving something he likes, so I'm adding something. So that is a positive reinforcer. Okay, I tell you what, Zachary made a D on his report card, so I made him paint the garage. What do you think? What is that? I made him paint the garage because he made a D on his report card, and I didn't like that. What would that be? I'd be curious to see. A positive punisher. Right. He didn't want to paint that garage, right? That's something negative I added to him. Great job. Fantastic. Okay. Zachary usually has to be in at 11 o'clock, but I told him, you know what, son, you made A's in your class all year long, so you do not have to come in until 1 o'clock. That is, I lifted his curfew for the entire summer. What would that be? But what if he likes painting? Good point. You know what, Draquan? Draquan brings up a great point. Reinforcers and punishers are, in fact, when they talk about applied behavior analysis, Draquan, what you have to do is you have to actually find out what that learner finds punishing and what that learner finds reinforcing. Mostly it's reinforcing. But Draquan brings up a good point. Not all animals want a food pellet. Not all people find broccoli reinforcing. Wow, that's a really good point, Draquan. Thank you for bringing that up. The nature of reinforcers can be quite personal. Okay, so between positive punisher and negative punishers, with a positive punisher, I'm going to add something you don't like. So you don't want to paint that garage. I'm adding something onto you. Okay? Now, compare making Zachary paint the garage, Ryan, okay, with taking away his car keys because he made a D on his report card. Compare number 2 and number 4, right? Both of those, I want him to stop making D's on his report card. But in number 2, I added something to him. And in number 4, I took something away from him. Okay. Now, both of those were designed to stop that behavior. Okay. So if he makes a D on his report card, he's going to paint something. If he makes a D on his report card, he's going to lose something. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And Yanan, you are very good on number 3. That is a negative reinforcer. That is a negative reinforcer. So I want him to engage in making straight A's. So I took something he didn't like away when he engaged in the proper behavior. Like taking the wheels off the car and making him look at it on jacks. Absolutely, Ryan. Absolutely. Yep. See what your behavior did? Now you don't have your car. Now you don't have your cell phone. That's a negative reinforcer. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. As a parent, as a psychologist, as a scientist, I will tell you, and this is not being a mushy liberal, but reinforcement is a better way to train an animal than is punishment. So a lot of parents, especially like parents like mine who grew up in the South, thought that the best way to do to raise your children was to spank them for the things that you didn't want them to do. But it turns out that animals, that punishment is not as effective or as efficient in getting the correct behaviors. Number one, punishment tells the learner what not to do. It does not tell the learner what to do, right? And so, really, what you want your child, what you want your pet, what you want any person, animal, or thing that you're trying to condition, you want to teach them what to do, not what to avoid so much, but you want an active animal that engages in things. And number two, punishers only work when the punisher is around. And most of you know this. You didn't do the things that you would get punished for when your parents were looking. But when your parents were away, the learned behavior tends to go away if the punisher goes away or is not available. And number three, the most important thing is the punishment creates aversive states towards the punisher. And so basically, by punishing your children, you're making them not like you. You're, in a sense, ruining the relationship. Now, punishment is necessary occasionally. You may engage in it once or twice. But what I'm telling you as a parent is it's going to be more effective if you can find ways to encourage your children to do the right things. Instead of focusing on what not to do, reinforce the behaviors that you want them to do. Okay? Now, here's the thing. This guy, B.F. Skinner, had these really cool experiments with animals, and he found that he could train very complex behaviors into animals. And he set it up so that the animal, he could flash lights, and the animal would know that it was only getting, it could only get a reward for pressing the bar when the light was on, or the animal would learn uh, to read, to in a sense, look at visuals and change their behavior. So I've actually got a video of what looks like a pigeon that can read. When a sign comes out, and when the sign says peck, the animal pecks and gets a food pellet. And then the sign changes and says turn, and the pigeon turns around in 360 degrees to get a pellet. And so this guy, B.F. Skinner, could train animals to distinguish between different types of reinforcers and stimuli and do fairly complex behaviors, and he could shape complex behaviors. This guy, John Watson, conditioned little Albert to have a phobia. And suddenly, these behaviors started believing that, that everything about human beings was controlled by the environment, and that all of our behavior can be explained as being a product of the environment. And in fact, he even wrote this book, this sort of a semi-philosophical book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And what B.F. Skinner said was, we do not need the terms of freedom and dignity. They don't exist. You are not free to engage in any behavior. Every behavior you have ever engaged in, you have been conditioned to engage in. Look at that quote by Skinner down at the bottom. I did not direct my life. I didn't design it. I never made decisions. Things came up and made decisions for me. That's what life is. And then if you look at this quote beneath me, it's even crazier. Uh, in the traditional view, a person is free. He is autonomous in the sense that his behavior is uncaused. He can therefore be held responsible for what he does and justly punished if he offends. That view, together with its associated practices, must be re-examined when a scientific analysis reveals controlling relations between behavior and environment. You know what he's saying down here? You don't have free will. Every behavior you have ever engaged in was created by either a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer, a positive punisher, a negative punisher, or some sort of classical conditioning. He argued that human beings do not have free will. And I swear to God, I got a quote on videotape where he actually says free will is a fiction. And he argues that even when we think, our thinking comes after our behavior and just tries to explain our behavior that has already been caused. So you don't want an ice cream. Instead, your body gets up and goes and gets an ice cream, and you try to explain to yourself after the fact that you have a loving desire for ice cream or this or that. But he argues that your environment tells you when to eat, what to wear, when to wear, how to act, and your mind just tries to figure out what you've been conditioned to do. Now, this is an extremely difficult point to defend scientifically. This is super duper extreme because if you say that everything is learned by the environment, then all somebody has to do to crush your position is show that something can't be explained by the environment. Does that make sense? I hope I'm explaining radical behaviorism and making sense here. Please type in the chat bar and let me know. Is anybody shocked by such a radical viewpoint? So this would mean we shouldn't hold people aren't guilty for the murders they commit. They've been conditioned to commit those. Now we may have to recondition them, but it's not their fault per se. All right. So he says that everything's caused by the environment. Now here's the deal. As soon as they make that crazy strong statement that everything is caused by the environment, people started showing that in fact was not true. In fact, they attacked them sort of two ways. Number one, learning does not overcome biology. And number two, that the mind is really important in determining our behavior. According to Skinner, and I know you folks think this is crazy, it's 2021, and this is something this is a belief that we've gotten rid of over 80 years ago. But the idea of behaviorists was that the mind doesn't matter. What you're thinking doesn't matter. So, two ways in which they challenge these beliefs of behaviorism. Number one, biology matters, and number two, the mind matters. Now, here's the deal. Quickly, it turns out that children learn language at the same speed and in the same pattern all over the world. Little children in China say their first word at 12 months, just like little children in Africa do. You know what? And children, deaf children, in a sense, learn to say their first word at 1 year of age. So it's kind of crazy that no matter where you go in the world, children learn language at the same speed. Children learn to babble at 3 months. Children start saying their first words at 12 months. Children all over the world start saying their first sentences at about 18 months of age. Now, here's the deal. If language is environmentally learned, then it should be different in different places. But language is learned the same way at the same speed everywhere. And it also turns out that there are examples of children who have not been exposed to language. We talked about Jeannie a couple of weeks ago. Jeannie was not exposed to language, and then she was never able to learn it. If the environment is king, then you should be able to start learning a language at any time. But language provides a good demonstration of how behaviorism is limited, all right, because there are some things that are biologically based. Okay, now he also found that there's this really cool experiment. I've got a demonstration that I could show you. It's the raccoon and the bank study, and what they found is that you could condition a raccoon to take a coin and put it into a bank, a little box with a slot in it, a little bank uh, for a reinforcer, for a little food pellet. But what they find is that when you give that animal a second coin, what they'll do is instead of uh, putting both of those coins into the box to get reinforcement, they'll start rubbing these coins together because that's an instinctual feeding behavior that they have. And so, what this fellow John Garcia, found is that sometimes instinct is more powerful than conditioning. And in fact, this Garcia went on to test classical conditioning in a little more stringent manner. And what he found is that some things cannot be classically conditioned. All right. Some things cannot be classically conditioned. We don't have time online to go into detail. I might do that in webinar tonight. But there's a really series of brilliant experiments he did to demonstrate that not everything can be classically conditioned, that not all relations can be classically conditioned. Now, what's another thing? It turns out that the mind does matter, and there were several demonstrations of learning. Now, uh, in behaviorism, there is no such thing as insight. Nobody figures anything out. Learning occurs incrementally, and it is reinforced, and it is mindless. But this guy named Wolfgang Kohler, who did his research on the Canary Islands in the early 30s and 40s, demonstrated that monkeys tended to show insightful behaviors. Monkeys would sort of figure problems out. And he did this banana in the box problem where he would give them 3 boxes. He would put them in a cage and he would spread 3 crates out all over the cage. And he would put a stick in the cage and he would hang bananas 20 feet up in the air. And the monkeys would see the bananas and want them. And what the monkeys would do is they would sit there and look at the bananas and around the room for a while. And all of a sudden, the monkeys would figure it out. They'd have their aha moment and they'd take the crates and they'd pull the 3 crates and they'd put 1 crate here underneath the bananas. They'd put another crate on top of it and a 3rd crate on top of it. And then they'd climb up on top with the stick and they could finally reach the bananas. Now, in behaviorism, each of those behaviors must have been conditioned, kind of like shaping. The first box has to be reinforced, then the second box has to be reinforced, then the third box has to be reinforced. But what Wolfgang Kohler found was monkeys just sort of hit upon a solution, and this was called insight learning. Another fellow named Edward Tolman found that rats learned the locations and pathways in a maze even when they weren't being reinforced, when they didn't receive the cheese. And so what you'll see is this graph right underneath me, group 3. So group 2 was a set of, he put these mice in a maze. And group 2, he put a piece of cheese at the end of the maze. And he measured how long it took the animal to navigate from one end of that maze to the other to find that piece of cheese. And this blue graph tells you how many errors, mistakes that animal made over a series of 11 days learning how to get to that cheese. Now, he would measure how many errors another rat made who wasn't getting cheese for the first 11 days. And what you'll see, that's the red line. And you'll notice that this rat that wasn't getting a piece of cheese for the first 11 days made lots of mistakes and didn't get to the end of the maze nearly as quickly as the rat that was getting cheese. But as soon as he started giving that rat cheese on the 12th day, that rat's performance dropped down and was as good and as error-free as the rat that had been getting cheese the whole time. Now, in behaviorism, an animal doesn't learn unless it's reinforced. However, Edward Tolman's rats on the red line weren't being reinforced, and yet they still showed an understanding of the locations in that maze. So these rats had a mental map of the maze in their mind. Now, a fellow named Albert Bandura, that's talked about in chapter 6, demonstrated modeling. And he showed that if you showed little children, a violent model, and put them in the same situation, that these children would behave aggressively, not violent, aggressively. And so he demonstrated that children model or copy behaviors that they see. Now, again, in behaviorism, it's all about the consequences. And seeing is not the same as consequences, right? And so all three of these areas, insight learning, cognitive maps, and modeling, were all experiments that were being done showing that the mind really did have power. Now, all of this would sort of coalesce into this brilliant moment in the late 1940s, 1947, when the computer was invented. And the computer was an electronic brain, if you will, an electronic mind. And it's kind of crazy, but the invention of the computer heralded the new age of psychology when we moved from the behaviorist perspective to the cognitive perspective. So you can sort of divide psychology into a behaviorist period when all the research was being done on operant and classical conditioning. From 1900 to about 1940, behaviorism was all psychology talked about. But starting in the late 30s and early 40s, this research began to accumulate, and the invention of the computer in 1947 kicked off a new era in psychology. And now psychology is in what we might call the cognitive era. So cognitive psychology and studying the systematic ways in which people think are what we're going to talk about next week in this class. Okay, I've finished 5 minutes. Actually, it's 10:15. Look at that. We started at 10:20 or 9:20, and I finished at 10:15. So it's a 55-minute lecture, even without me paying attention to the time. Is everybody okay? Did any of that make any sense? Does anybody have any questions? Remember, we're going to have webinar at 1 p.m. today and at 8 p.m. today. 1 p.m. today and at 8 p.m. today. We're going to be talking about the behaviorist perspective. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about using classical and operant conditioning. I've got a cool demonstration or two that I'm going to show you, these videos. And then we're going to again talk about what it means to really be anti-mentalistic. So hopefully it'll be an interesting webinar today at 1 or 8 p.m. April, Draquan, John, Yanan, Ryan, it was really good to see everybody today. I want to thank you for coming. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the very beginning of this class. I got those worked out. Sometimes we have, sometimes those things happen, but thank you very much for coming back to class. I really, really, really appreciate it. Hey, have a great day, and I will see you in webinar today. Take care.